Amid the scorching heat of New York, the Astoria Hotel stood like a grand palace, a sanctuary for the rich and powerful. But beneath its towering shadow, something far more unusual was taking place. A man, ragged and disheveled, with wild hair and a scruffy beard, lingered in the background, watching the opulence unfold before him. Little did anyone know, this man, seemingly homeless, harbored a secret so powerful it would make the world reconsider everything. And today, he would make them all question what they thought they knew. Before we continue with this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we'll bring you another special story just for you. The sun was beginning to dip beneath the towering skyscrapers of New York, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. The Astoria Hotel, with its opulent facade of marble and glass, stood like a fortress of luxury amid the chaotic energy of the city. Its grand entrance was always a spectacle. Elegantly dressed people arrived in black sedans, their shoes clicking on the polished floors, while doormen greeted them with practiced smiles. Inside, the world was pristine, flawless, and carefully curated, where every detail whispered wealth and exclusivity. But outside, on the sidewalk where the polished marble met the worn cobblestone, there was something different. A figure in ragged clothes stood against the cold wind, his face hidden beneath the hood of a tattered jacket, hands stuffed into pockets as if trying to keep some semblance of warmth. His shoes were scuffed and soaked from the wet pavement, and his beard, thick and unkempt, gave him an air of someone who had lived on the streets for far too long. He looked nothing like the carefully groomed patrons of the hotel, nothing like the polished world inside. Yet, beneath this grimy exterior was a mind sharp enough to cut through the facade of the rich and powerful. This man, seemingly out of place in this luxurious setting, was none other than Keanu Reeves. The same Keanu Reeves who had graced screens worldwide as an actor in blockbuster films, the same face that had been on magazine covers, at award shows, and in the public eye for years. But today, there was no glimmer of fame in his eyes, no hint of the Hollywood smile. He was just a man, lost in the crowd, watching from the outside. Keanu had been planning this moment for weeks. The Astoria Hotel had always fascinated him, not for its luxury or its renowned reputation, but because of what it represented. It was a place where the elite could escape the judgment of the world, where money was the key to everything. People walked through its doors, oblivious to the lives of those who stood just beyond its threshold, yearning for entry. For Keanu, this was more than just curiosity. It was a challenge, a chance to see how far he could go, to understand a world he had long been a part of but never truly lived in. Why disguise himself as a homeless man? Some might call it absurd, a stunt, or perhaps a statement. But for Keanu, it was a way to strip away the layers of fame, to become invisible and enter a world where appearances were everything and yet nothing at all. He wanted to know if anyone would truly see him, or if they would only see the mask he wore. And so, dressed in the shabby clothes of a man who had nowhere to go, he made his way toward the Astoria. As he approached the entrance, he felt the familiar mix of excitement and trepidation. He had done things like this before, incognito appearances, experiments in anonymity, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. The hotel's towering doors seemed to represent everything he had ever worked for, and yet, in this moment, they felt like an impenetrable wall. The doorman stood rigid by the entrance, eyes scanning the crowds for any signs of trouble. The moment Keanu stepped into his line of sight, the doorman's gaze hardened, no doubt sizing him up. But Keanu held his ground, his gaze unwavering, giving nothing away. He had rehearsed this, practiced how to walk, how to stand, how to act. His mind was sharp, calculating each movement. He knew exactly what kind of impression he needed to leave. He wasn't just any man. He was someone with a plan, someone who understood how to navigate the world in ways others could never imagine. He was about to test just how far his disguise could get him. And so, he took another step forward, his eyes locked on the golden doors, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached the entrance, he paused. The doorman had seen him. Their eyes met briefly, too briefly. but long enough for the doorman to feel the weight of Keanu's presence. The moment hung in the air, thick with the promise of what was to come. Would the man at the door let him in? Or would he see through the facade? Keanu could feel the weight of the doorman's gaze on him, like a silent judgment that echoed louder than any words could. The brief moment of eye contact passed, and Keanu's heart beat faster. He hadn't expected this instant to be so crucial. He had prepared himself for the awkwardness of his disguise, but now, with everything on the line, he had to act. "Can I help you, sir?" The doorman's voice cut through the tension. It was polite, but there was an underlying note of suspicion in his tone. Keanu could see the man's eyes flicking toward his worn shoes, then to his disheveled jacket. But he didn't flinch. He didn't waver. Instead, Keanu straightened up, adjusting his posture as though the weight of the world suddenly shifted from his shoulders. "I need to speak with someone inside," Keanu said, his voice steady but with a trace of urgency, as if this request was just as natural as any other. "I'm here on business." The doorman's brow furrowed slightly. Business? The word seemed out of place, coming from someone who looked like he'd spent the past few nights under a bridge. But Keanu didn't look like someone ready to be turned away, and the doorman hesitated for a moment, the wheels turning in his head. Before he could respond, a figure approached from inside the hotel, tall, well-dressed, with an air of authority. This was the man Keanu had been waiting for, the hotel manager. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and his suit pressed to perfection. He looked every bit the part of someone who had seen it all, someone who was always in control of any situation. "Is there a problem here, Thomas?" The manager's voice was smooth, almost too smooth, as he directed the question to the doorman without even glancing at Keanu. His tone suggested an air of superiority, as if he had better things to worry about than someone like Keanu, a man who didn't belong here. The doorman hesitated for a moment, looking back and forth between the manager and Keanu. "This man, he says he's here on business," Thomas replied, his tone still unsure. "But I don't think he doesn't quite look the part." The manager finally turned his gaze toward Keanu, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight. The brief glance was enough to make Keanu feel like he had been judged and dismissed in one fell swoop. He could see the manager's mind ticking away, weighing the value of someone like him in the grand scheme of things. In that moment, Keanu was nothing more than an inconvenience, a blip in the manager's otherwise perfect day. "What business do you have here?" the manager asked, his voice colder now, laced with the same judgment the doorman had given him earlier. His gaze lingered on Keanu's face for a moment, before his eyes dropped to the rest of his attire, then back up to his eyes again, as if trying to find something that could justify his presence. Keanu had prepared for this. He knew this was coming. He had rehearsed his answers, practiced his body language, and played out every possible scenario. In this moment, he wasn't Keanu Reeves, the famous actor. He was just a man who had a purpose, a reason to be here. He locked eyes with the manager, matching his cold, calculating stare with one of his own. "I've been asked to deliver an important message," Keanu replied, his voice calm but firm, his eyes unwavering. "And I need access to the penthouse." The manager's eyes flickered with something: surprise, skepticism, maybe even irritation. "The penthouse?" he repeated, as if the very idea of someone like Keanu needing to go there was laughable. "I think you've made a mistake. There's no business for you here." Keanu knew this was where the real challenge began. The hotel manager was a man who had seen countless people like Keanu, people who had come in, only to be sent away without a second glance. He was used to handling situations like this, and Keanu had no doubt the manager was about to dismiss him without a second thought. But Keanu wasn't here for just a conversation. He wasn't here to be dismissed. He was here to test the limits of what people could perceive. "I'm not asking for permission," Keanu said, his voice now taking on a more authoritative tone, a quiet power that surprised even him. He took a step forward, close enough for the manager to feel his presence. "I'm telling you that I need to speak with someone upstairs, and I won't leave until I do." The manager's expression faltered for a split second. His eyes scanned Keanu from head to toe, as if looking for something that would explain the strange confidence that radiated from him. For a brief moment, Keanu saw it, a flicker of doubt in the manager's eyes. It was only a moment, but it was enough. Enough to make Keanu realize that the man wasn't as invincible as he thought. Before the manager could respond, Thomas, the doorman, spoke up again. "Sir, I don't think." "Leave us." The manager interjected sharply, cutting him off. His gaze remained locked on Keanu, his face now a mask of indifference. "I'll handle this." The doorman hesitated, but then nodded and stepped back, leaving Keanu alone with the manager. This was no longer just a simple misunderstanding. This was a battle of wills, a moment where Keanu would either succeed in his mission or be cast out like so many others before him. The manager crossed his arms, sizing up the man before him with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. "You'll leave now," he said, his voice low and commanding, "or I'll have you removed." Keanu could see the final test coming, and he was ready for it. The manager's words lingered in the air, hanging like a threat, but Keanu refused to back down. The challenge had only just begun, and he knew that the next step was critical. He wasn't here to be intimidated. He wasn't here to take no for an answer. He was here to expose a system that valued appearances over truth, a world where the wealthy and powerful could control everything without ever questioning their privilege. Keanu had made it this far. He wasn't about to stop now. The manager stared at him with an air of superiority, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture rigid. There was a moment of silence between them, and for the first time, Keanu could see the cracks in the manager's confidence. The facade of calmness was beginning to slip, just a little. Keanu pressed forward, a subtle shift in his body language that spoke volumes. "Look," Keanu said, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not going to stand here and argue with you, but I'm telling you, I have business in the penthouse, and you're either going to let me through, or I'll find another way in." The manager's jaw tightened, but he didn't immediately respond. His gaze flickered toward the security desk inside the lobby, as if silently calculating the risk of letting someone like Keanu, someone so clearly out of place, pass through the doors. Keanu could almost see the gears turning in the man's mind. The manager's job was on the line if he made a wrong move. This was a hotel where the rules were absolute, where no one got special treatment, and where appearances were everything. The mere thought of someone like Keanu trying to enter the building without an invitation must have seemed preposterous. But Keanu wasn't playing by their rules. Not anymore. With a slight nod, the manager stepped aside, motioning toward the doors. "Go ahead," he said, his voice barely a whisper, laced with irritation. "But you'll regret it." Keanu could feel the weight of those words, but he didn't let them slow him down. He had no intention of backing off now. He knew that, in this moment, his greatest asset wasn't his fame, his money, or his past. It was his ability to adapt, to remain calm and poised, no matter the situation. The moment the manager stepped aside, Keanu walked past him with deliberate slowness, making sure to exude an air of confidence, of purpose. The lobby was just as grand as he had imagined. Gleaming marble floors, towering columns, and delicate chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, casting soft golden light across the space. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, and the few patrons who were lounging in the plush chairs gave Keanu a quick, dismissive glance before returning to their business. They didn't care about the man who had just walked in. Not really. He was nothing more than an anomaly to them, a passing curiosity. But for Keanu, it wasn't about fitting in with the people here. It wasn't about being seen as just another guest. He had a job to do, and that job meant getting to the penthouse without raising suspicion, without drawing attention. He had been told that the manager would eventually let him pass, but there was always the possibility that someone else, someone higher up in the hotel's hierarchy, would recognize him. They would see through his disguise and call security, and that would be the end of it. As he walked through the lobby, he couldn't help but notice how the atmosphere seemed to change around him. The moment he passed through the doors, something invisible shifted. It was subtle at first, just a small shift in the way the staff looked at him, the way they moved. There was a hesitation in the air, a slight pause in their otherwise efficient actions. It was as if they weren't sure whether to treat him like everyone else or to recognize the silent rebellion in his every movement. Keanu took a slow breath and approached the elevator at the far end of the lobby. He kept his face expressionless, his eyes forward, never meeting anyone's gaze for too long. The elevator was empty, just as he had hoped. Without a second thought, he pressed the button for the penthouse. He could feel the eyes of the staff on him, but he didn't falter. As the elevator doors closed and the soft chime echoed in the empty space, Keanu exhaled. He had made it this far. But the hardest part was still ahead of him. The real test wasn't just about getting through the doors. It wasn't about whether the manager had relented. It was about how far he could push this, how deep he could go before someone noticed something wasn't quite right. The elevator ascended, the soft hum of the machinery filling the silence. Keanu leaned against the wall, his mind racing. He wasn't just a man in disguise anymore. He was someone on the edge of something much bigger, something that, when it was revealed, would change everything. The elevator hummed steadily as it ascended, carrying Keanu toward the top of the Astoria Hotel, where the penthouse awaited. His mind raced, not with excitement, but with anticipation. He was so close to the goal now, so close to breaking through the walls of this meticulously controlled world. But he couldn't afford to let his guard down, not for a second. Every floor he passed was another step toward the unknown. The elevator reached the top, its soft chime filling the quiet. The doors slid open, and Keanu stepped out into a long hallway bathed in soft golden light. The walls were lined with rare paintings, their frames gilded in gold. The plush carpet beneath his feet whispered with each step. This was a different world. This wasn't the lobby, with its polished marble and tired doormen. This was the heart of the Astoria, a place reserved only for those who belonged. But Keanu wasn't like them, and that's exactly why he was here. Ahead, at the end of the hallway, stood a pair of massive double doors, guarded by two more security officers, their eyes scanning every inch of the corridor. Keanu could feel the weight of their gaze, cold and calculating, as if they were assessing every person who passed by for any sign of threat. The doors weren't just entrances, they were barriers, symbolic of everything that separated the elite from the rest of the world. They were the last line of defense, the final threshold that Keanu had to cross. As he approached, his pulse quickened. His heart beat louder in his ears, each thrum a reminder of what was at stake. Keanu adjusted his posture, walking with purpose, his eyes straight ahead. There was no room for hesitation now. The guards would see right through him if he faltered, if he showed any sign of weakness. The key to this moment was confidence. He had to walk as though he belonged here, as though there was no question in his mind that this was where he was meant to be. The closer he got to the doors, the more he could feel the eyes of the guards boring into him. One of them shifted slightly, his hand resting casually on the handle of a concealed weapon, but the other didn't move, his eyes never leaving Keanu's face. It was as if they were waiting for something to happen, waiting for a reason to step in, to stop him before he could get too far. Keanu didn't slow down. He was almost there. But he knew the real test was just beginning. He had to make it past the guards, past the gatekeepers who had been trained to spot the outliers, the people who didn't belong. There would be no more disguises, no more acting. The time for subtlety was over. Keanu had to face them head-on. When he reached the guards, the one closest to him spoke first, his voice low, but firm. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said, his eyes narrowing as he looked Keanu over. "May I ask what your business is here?" Keanu stopped just in front of them, standing tall, his eyes locking with the guards. For a brief moment, the world seemed to shrink around him, and the tension between them grew heavier, almost tangible. There was no room for error now. The guard's question was almost too polite, as if he were waiting for Keanu to break character, to stammer or hesitate. He couldn't afford to give them that satisfaction. He had to act as though he had all the time in the world, as though everything was in perfect control. "I'm here to see someone," Keanu said, his voice smooth, confident. "I've been invited." The guard raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Invited? By who?" Keanu didn't flinch. "By the owner," he replied, his voice unwavering. The lie came effortlessly, and the words slipped from his mouth without hesitation. He knew this wasn't just a chance encounter. It was the culmination of everything he had planned. The owners of the hotel had always been shrouded in mystery, their names whispered but never confirmed. It was the perfect cover. No one could easily disprove his claim. For a moment, the guard just stood there, eyes searching Keanu's face for any hint of deception. But Keanu kept his gaze steady, allowing no hint of uncertainty to show. He knew that if the guards were even slightly unsure, they'd call for backup, and then everything would fall apart. He couldn't let that happen. The other guard, who had been silent up until this point, finally spoke. "We'll need verification before you can proceed." His voice was matter-of-fact, and the shift in tone told Keanu that this wasn't a simple procedure. They weren't about to let anyone pass these doors without confirmation. They had no way of knowing who he was, or why he had been sent here, and that uncertainty was enough to make them hesitate. Keanu took a slow breath, his mind already working through the next step. He had been expecting this. He knew they would ask for verification, but he had also anticipated this exact moment, the one where everything could fall apart. The key was to stay calm, to keep his composure, and to push forward with confidence. He couldn't afford to show them any sign of weakness now. "You can call," Keanu said, his voice steady, "but I don't have time to wait. The message I have is urgent." His eyes flickered from one guard to the other, and he saw the briefest moment of indecision in their eyes. They didn't move. Not yet. The silence between them stretched on, the tension thick enough to choke. Keanu stepped forward, just enough to make his presence undeniable, without getting too close. The guards exchanged a quick glance, communicating without words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of them turned and reached for the intercom on the wall beside the doors. "Urgent message," the guard muttered into the device, his voice low. Keanu held his breath, waiting for what would come next. Keanu's heart raced as the silence stretched on, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. The intercom buzzed to life, and the guard's low voice crackled through, speaking into the device as if trying to confirm the lie Keanu had spun. The seconds felt like hours. Every part of him was alert, aware that one wrong move could blow everything apart. But just as the tension reached its peak, the guard lowered the intercom and looked up at Keanu. His face was a mask of calculation, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Step aside," the guard said. It wasn't an order. It was a warning. Keanu didn't flinch. He took one more deliberate step forward, his movements slow, measured, a calculated risk. "I don't have time for this. If I don't get through, it's going to be your problem, not mine." The guard's eyes flickered to his partner, who stood a few paces behind. For a split second, Keanu could see the doubt, the hesitation, flickering in the second guard's eyes. He was unsure. He was about to break, but the first guard wasn't. "I'm afraid I can't let you pass, sir," the first guard said, his voice colder now. He took another step toward Keanu, blocking the door with his body. "You're not on the list." Keanu met his gaze with a calmness that bordered on indifference. "Then call the owner. Get confirmation. You know who I am." The guard remained unmoved, his stance still rigid, his eyes cold. The tension in the air was so thick it was suffocating. Keanu could feel the anxiety creeping into his body, his muscles tightening as he realized this was it. This was the final stand. There was no way out unless he made his move now. "You don't understand, do you?" Keanu said, his voice low but urgent. He took another step closer, closing the gap between them. "This isn't just about a list. This is about power. And right now, I have it. You're not the one in control here." The guard hesitated again, his jaw clenched tightly. It was a small crack, but it was enough. The second guard, sensing the shift, moved slightly, his hand drifting toward his radio. Keanu saw the movement and knew it was his chance. With one swift motion, Keanu pushed past the first guard, who stumbled backward in surprise. The second guard lunged forward, but Keanu was faster, already through the doorway and into the penthouse hallway before the guard could catch up. The air inside the penthouse was cooler, charged with the hum of electricity from the chandelier that hung overhead. Everything about the space screamed luxury. Plush carpets, expansive windows that framed the New York skyline, and furniture so sleek and modern it looked like something out of a high-end magazine. But none of that mattered to Keanu now. His eyes scanned the room quickly, looking for any sign of the owner, any sign of his next move. He didn't have time to linger. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, and he knew the guards would be hot on his trail. They wouldn't give up easily. Keanu could hear them shouting, their voices filled with urgency, but he didn't turn around. He had one goal now, to get to the inner sanctum of the penthouse, to confront the one who pulled the strings from the shadows. The hallway narrowed as Keanu moved deeper into the penthouse, his feet moving silently over the thick carpet. The lights overhead flickered, casting brief shadows that danced across the walls. His breath quickened, but his resolve was unwavering. He was close now, so close he could almost taste it. Suddenly, a door at the far end of the hallway opened, and a tall figure stepped into the room. Keanu froze, his body going still. This was it. The figure was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his features sharp and commanding. He had the look of someone who didn't need to introduce himself because everyone already knew who he was. The owner, the man behind the hotel, behind everything Keanu had been fighting against. "You shouldn't be here," the owner said, his voice calm but filled with authority. He didn't even flinch at Keanu's presence. "This isn't a place for people like you." Keanu's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "And yet, here I am." The owner's gaze flickered toward the guards who had finally caught up to Keanu, standing in the doorway behind him. But his attention quickly returned to Keanu. "You've made your point, but you don't belong here. You never did." Keanu took a step closer, his eyes locking onto the owner's with unwavering intensity. "I'm exactly where I belong. You've built this empire on lies, on deception, but it's coming down, and I'm the one who's going to tear it all apart." The tension between them was palpable, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. The guards were positioned behind Keanu now, ready to intervene, but the owner held up a hand, signaling them to wait. Keanu knew this was the moment. Everything he had done, everything he had sacrificed, had led him here. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been crushed by a system that didn't care. And this man, standing before him, was the embodiment of that system. "You think you can win?" the owner asked, his voice filled with a cold, quiet confidence. "You think you can take it all down with a few words and a fight? You're nothing. You're a shadow." Keanu's eyes narrowed. Maybe, but even shadows can make the world darker. The air in the penthouse felt thick with tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for the storm to hit. Keanu stood in front of the owner, unflinching, the weight of everything he had endured settling heavily in his chest. The guards behind him were tense, poised to act at a moment's notice, but they held back, seemingly uncertain of their next move. "You really think you can destroy everything I've built?" the owner asked, his voice smooth, but edged with disbelief. "You're a nobody. You're nothing compared to the empire I've created. You're wasting your time." Keanu's eyes burned with intensity, the fire of someone who had nothing left to lose. His words came out slow, deliberate, as if each syllable was a weapon carefully chosen to strike. "You've spent your life taking from others," Keanu said, his voice cold. "You've built your empire on the backs of people who didn't have the power to fight back. But now, you've met someone who does. And that's where everything changes." The owner chuckled, but it was a hollow sound, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You think you can just waltz in here, disrupt everything, and walk away untouched? You're delusional. You're not the first to try." Keanu shook his head. "No, I'm not. But I'm the one who's going to succeed." With a swift movement, he turned toward the center of the room, where a large desk sat, covered in papers, contracts, and documents that represented everything the owner had built. Without a second thought, Keanu reached forward and swept everything off the desk in a single motion. The sound of paper hitting the floor echoed through the room, a sharp, decisive noise that signaled the beginning of the end. The owner's face twisted with rage, his calm facade slipping. "You think this is the end? You think this will change anything?" He took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists, but Keanu didn't back down. He stood his ground, the intensity of the moment swirling around them. "This is only the beginning," Keanu said, his voice gaining strength. "The truth always comes out in the end. You can't hide behind your wealth, your power, your lies forever. People will see you for what you really are." The owner took another step forward, his eyes narrowing, but this time, something in his gaze shifted. There was fear in his eyes now. For the first time, he seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Keanu wasn't just a threat to his personal pride. He was a threat to everything he had spent his life building. The walls of his carefully constructed world were beginning to crumble, and Keanu had set the match to start the fire. "You're not going to get away with this," the owner hissed, his voice filled with venom. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. You think you can just take down my empire? I'll destroy you first." Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer to the owner, his voice lower now, but every word a bullet aimed straight at the heart. "I'm not here to take it down. I'm here to show the world who you really are." "That's enough." Behind him, the guards exchanged uneasy glances, their hands still hovering over their weapons. They were caught in a standoff, unsure whether to follow their orders or to side with the man who stood in front of them, defiant, fearless, and resolute. Keanu knew they were waiting for the owner's signal, but he also knew the longer they waited, the more the situation would slip out of the owner's control. As if on cue, the owner's demeanor changed, the cocky arrogance shifting into something darker, more dangerous. He took a step back, his eyes now sharp, calculating. The room was deathly quiet, the tension in the air thick and suffocating. The guards were frozen, the conflict between duty and doubt playing out in their minds. Keanu's gaze never wavered from the owner's face, the power dynamics shifting with every passing second. And then, just as the standoff reached its peak, the sound of distant sirens echoed through the windows. The moment of calm before the storm. The owner's eyes widened, and for a split second, Keanu could see the cracks in his armor. The facade of control, the illusion of power, all of it was beginning to fade. The sirens grew louder, growing closer by the second. The reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. The authorities were coming. His empire was on the verge of collapse. Keanu turned his head slightly, acknowledging the sound with a small, knowing smile. "You're finished," he said, the finality in his words unmistakable. The owner stood frozen, caught in the web of his own lies, the walls he had built around himself crumbling faster than he could process. Keanu could see it in his eyes, the realization that the world he had so carefully constructed was falling apart, piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. In the distance, the sirens grew louder still, signaling the end of an era. The collapse was imminent, and with it, the fall of a man who had spent his life in pursuit of power, oblivious to the destruction he had caused along the way. Keanu turned away from the owner, his job done. There was no need to stay and watch the fallout. The world would take care of the rest. The sound of the sirens grew louder, reverberating through the thick glass of the penthouse windows. Keanu stood still, his back to the owner, his eyes focused on the distant flashing lights as they drew closer. The tension in the room had finally reached its breaking point. There was nothing left to do but wait for the inevitable. Behind him, the guards stood frozen, caught between their duty and the realization that this was a battle they had already lost. The owner, once so confident, so certain of his unassailable power, now seemed small, diminished by the weight of his own mistakes. Keanu could feel it, the shift in the atmosphere, the surrender of the man who had built his empire on the backs of others, now watching it all fall apart in front of him. "I told you," Keanu said, his voice calm and steady, "that the truth always comes out. You can't hide forever." The owner didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. He knew it was over. His empire, his reputation, everything he had spent decades building, was crumbling. Keanu had exposed him for what he truly was, and there was no going back from that. The world outside would soon know the truth, and the consequences would follow. The distant wail of the sirens was now deafening, signaling the arrival of the authorities. Keanu didn't need to see them to know what was coming. He had already won. The people who had been oppressed by the owner's empire would finally have their day. The lies that had kept the hotel and the owner on top were about to be exposed for all to see. Keanu took one last look at the owner, whose face was now twisted in defeat. The man who had once seemed untouchable was now nothing more than a shell of the person he had once been. His wealth, his power, his influence, all of it had been stripped away. "You could have chosen differently," Keanu said, his voice softer now, almost pitying. "You didn't have to do this. You could have used your power to make a difference, to help people instead of exploiting them. But you chose the easy path, the path of greed and manipulation. And now, this is the price you pay." The owner's eyes flashed with anger, but there was no fight left in him. He knew he had been bested, outplayed. Keanu had succeeded where so many others had failed. He had broken the cycle. Without another word, Keanu turned and walked toward the door. The guards didn't try to stop him this time. They simply watched as he walked out, their faces blank, unsure of what to do next. The owner, once so powerful, was now a hollow figure in the middle of the room, his future uncertain. Keanu stepped into the elevator, his mind racing with the events that had just unfolded. The battle had been long, and the cost had been high, but in the end, he had emerged victorious. He had proven that even the most powerful figures could fall, that the truth always had a way of coming to light, no matter how hard it was buried. As the elevator doors closed behind him, Keanu let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The weight of the moment began to sink in. He had done what he set out to do. He had taken down the man who had ruled with an iron fist. And now it was time for the world to see what had really been happening behind the scenes. The elevator descended slowly, each floor taking Keanu closer to freedom. As he reached the lobby, he could already hear the sounds of chaos from the outside. The police cars, the flashing lights, the reporters who would soon swarm the hotel. He knew that his actions would have consequences, but he was ready for them. He had done what needed to be done. Outside, the cold New York air hit him as the elevator doors opened. The flashing lights of the police vehicles reflected off the towering buildings around him. The city, for all its glory and its grime, would never be the same again. Keanu had ensured that. As he walked into the night, a sense of satisfaction washed over him. This wasn't just about taking down one man. It was about showing the world that no one was above accountability, that even the most powerful could be brought to their knees if they were willing to face the truth. Keanu had done his part. Now, it was time for the world to catch up. He glanced back at the hotel one last time. The tall, imposing building was a symbol of everything that had been wrong with the world, a symbol of greed and corruption. But now, it was just a building, a hollow shell, waiting for the truth to burn it all to the ground. Keanu smiled to himself, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. He had changed things, and that was all that mattered.